Margaret Doyle had guarded the elevator bank on the 40th floor of Calder Tower for 23 years, and in all that time she had learned to read a building the way other women read weather. She knew the hour Julian Calder arrived by the particular hush that traveled ahead of him down the corridor, reaching the mailroom before his footsteps did. She knew which executives straightened their ties when his office door opened and which ones, fewer of them every year, no longer needed to. Calder Industries had been a shipping and logistics company once, 3 generations back, before it grew into the kind of family enterprise that owned ports and warehouses and the loyalty of half the men who ran them. People who had never met Julian Calder still lowered their voices when they said his name in negotiating rooms 2 cities away. He had inherited the business at 34, when his father died, and had spent the 11 years since making it very clear, in boardrooms and courtrooms and a handful of hostile takeovers that other firms still spoke of carefully, that he was not a man worth underestimating. She had seen what that reputation cost other people up close, twice. Once, a competitor's lawyer had come up to the 40th floor convinced he held the stronger hand in a port leasing dispute, and left 2 hours later having signed away terms he hadn't walked in willing to discuss, because Julian Calder had simply waited him out, silent and unhurried, the way a tide waits out a man standing too long on wet sand. Another time, a junior executive had tried to take credit in a board meeting for work that wasn't his. Julian had said nothing in the room at all, only asked, very quietly, for the man's calendar from the relevant weeks, and the executive had resigned by Friday without ever being told to. No one ever saw Julian Calder raise his voice. They didn't need to. The fear that moved through Calder Tower wasn't built on threats, it was built on the certainty that he noticed everything, eventually, and remembered all of it. Margaret had also, over 23 years, stopped expecting much from the interns who rotated through the glass doors each season, bright, nervous, gone again by autumn, names she rarely bothered to learn. She almost didn't learn this one's name either. Nora Bishop arrived in March with a second-hand briefcase and a gray cardigan mended at one elbow, assigned to the corporate strategy group on a 6-month returnship after 4 years away from any office at all. She had spent those 4 years nursing her mother through a long illness that the woman's modest savings, and then Nora's, had never come close to covering. Her mother had died the previous winter, and Nora had taken the returnship less because she wanted to climb anything than because she needed, finally, somewhere to put her hands. She was older than the other interns by half a decade and twice as careful with everything, her time, her words, the photocopies she made without being asked twice. Margaret noticed, in the detached way she noticed most things from behind her desk, that Nora always said good morning to the night cleaning crew by name, and almost never to the partners, who rarely looked up long enough to be greeted. She noticed, too, the week a senior associate spilled an entire pot of coffee across a junior analyst's desk and walked off to a meeting without a backward glance. It was Nora, on her way to the copier, who quietly mopped it up and salvaged the man's notes before the ink could run, and never mentioned it to anyone, including the man himself. The cousin noticed something else in her. Desmond Whitlock had married Julian's younger sister a decade earlier and stayed on after her death as vice president of corporate strategy, wearing the title the way some men wear a debt they believe the world owes them rather than the reverse. He was not unkind, exactly, he was worse than unkind, in the quiet, efficient way of a man who has learned that charm costs less than cruelty and accomplishes the same things. In Nora he saw exactly what he wanted, someone grateful enough for the chance to ask very few questions. So it was Desmond who handed her, on a Thursday evening in April, nearly 400 pages of the pending merger agreement with Drummond Shipping and asked her only to check the formatting before the board's Monday vote. He said it lightly, the way a man says something he intends for no one to take seriously, and went home for the evening. Nora took it seriously anyway. She read every page once for sense and a second time for structure, the habit of 2 years spent untangling hospital billing codes that were never written to be understood by the people who had to pay them. By 10 o'clock something in section 14.3 had stopped sitting right, too carefully worded, too many phrases pointing back to a definition buried 4 exhibits away, the kind of sentence built to be skimmed rather than read. By midnight she had traced it fully, a dormant trigger clause that would convert a slice of Calder Industries' founding voting shares into Drummond stock the moment Drummond's own board changed hands, which a separate public filing she had no real business knowing how to search, but did, because she had spent 2 years learning to search exactly this kind of thing on her mother's behalf, showed was already quietly under negotiation. It was not a clerical error. It was a door, propped open and painted over to look like a wall. She wrote it out by hand on a yellow legal pad, 3 clauses circled in blue ink, with the page numbers and a single line beneath them. This gives away control of the company in 18 months, and almost no one would ever read far enough to see it. She left the page clipped to the formatted documents on Desmond's desk, because that was the order things were supposed to go, and walked home past Margaret's dark, empty desk a little after 1 in the morning, leaving only a note that she'd locked the strategy floor behind her. Desmond found the legal pad page Friday morning, read it twice, and fed it through the shredder before his coffee had cooled. He had not accounted for the fact that Nora, out of the same caution that made her photocopy everything she touched, had kept a second copy folded into her bag. She might have let the matter rest there. She told Margaret, much later, that she had nearly talked herself into believing she'd misread something, that surely 4 law firms and a man as exacting as Julian Calder would have caught what a 6-month intern had caught in one overnight read. But 2 days after that, at the family's quarterly dinner held 1 floor below the boardroom, a dinner Nora attended only to take minutes for the informal, family business portion that always followed dessert, she watched Desmond slide a single page across the white tablecloth to Eleanor Calder, Julian's mother, 78 years old, who had helped build half of what the company now was before her son was even born, and say, in the same light voice he had used on Nora, that it was simply the routine renewal of her voting proxy, nothing requiring close reading, just her signature where he'd already marked it. Eleanor's eyes were not what they once had been. She had her pen already uncapped. It was Nora who set down the coffee pot she'd been refilling glasses with and said, quietly enough that only the table heard her, "Mrs. Calder, would you like me to read it through first? I'm quicker at this than most people, from practice I didn't ask for." It was such a small thing, a girl with a coffee pot, offering to read a page aloud before an old woman signed it. Desmond laughed, not unkindly so much as dismissively, the laugh of a man certain nothing in the room could possibly trouble him, and told her to go ahead, she'd find it terribly dull. Nora read it slowly, clause by clause, in the plain voice she might have used reading a grocery list aloud, until she reached the line defining a triggering event by reference to Exhibit J, and Exhibit J, in turn, referred to a document that was nowhere on the table in front of Eleanor Calder at all. The room went very still. At the head of the table, Julian Calder, who had said almost nothing through the whole meal, set down his glass without a sound and looked, for the first time that evening, directly at the new intern with the coffee pot. He asked her, once the dinner had broken apart and the others had gone, to write down everything she'd found, in her own hand, the way she'd written it the first time. She did, at the long table, under the chandelier, while he stood at the window with his back to her and did not interrupt once. When she finished, he read the page twice, the same way she had read the contract twice, and said only, "How long did it take you to see this?" It wasn't really a question either. "A few hours," she said. "Most of one night." He folded the page once, carefully, along the crease she'd already made, and put it in his breast pocket instead of handing it to legal, which Margaret, who had been sent in to clear the glasses and was taking far longer at it than the task required, noticed, and never forgot. What happened over the 10 days that followed, Margaret pieced together mostly from who came and went through her elevator bank, and at what hours. Outside counsel arrived twice that week carrying boxes instead of briefcases. Desmond Whitlock stopped coming to the office after the second Tuesday. The board convened without him on a Thursday that ran nearly 4 hours, and when the directors finally filed out, 2 of them, men who had always seemed faintly afraid of him, were the unfamiliar look of people who had just said something out loud they'd wanted to say for years. There was no scene in the lobby, no shouting that carried down the hall, nothing in the papers, only the slow, total, lawful dismantling of a man's position, clause by clause, in much the same patient way he had tried to dismantle a company. He was removed from the board, his trading referred to the regulators, his name off the directory by the following Monday morning, as if he had simply never been listed there at all. Nora Bishop, through all of it, kept arriving at 8 o'clock in the same mended cardigan, doing the work nobody had thought yet to thank her for, because it had genuinely not occurred to her that anyone would. Julian Calder learned, 3 weeks after that dinner, exactly what the 6 months of her returnship had cost her, not from Nora, who would never have volunteered it, but by accident, from a benefits coordinator filling out a routine form, 2 years of hospital bills carried alone, a collections notice still sitting unopened in a drawer because she could not yet bear to read the total. He looked at the figure twice and said nothing to anyone about what he did next. Margaret only learned of it because the hospital's billing office, by some clerical mistake, rang the executive floor instead of strategy, asking to confirm a wire transfer, and Margaret, certain she had misdialed something, patched the call straight through to Julian Calder's office rather than lose it. He took it without hesitation. "Yes," he said simply, "that's correct." Mark the account paid in full and send no further notices. He hung up before anyone could think to ask his name a second time. He never once told Nora it had been him. She learned the way people usually learn something true about a quiet man, a little too late to thank him properly, and not nearly in time to keep her hands from shaking once she finally understood. The last quarterly dinner of that year ran later than any before it. Margaret was asked, unusually, to set the table herself, and Julian Calder gave her the seating chart in his own handwriting, one place more than the family had used at that table in a decade, set not at the foot where guests were seated but at his mother's right hand, a chair no one outside blood had occupied since old Walter Calder built the company 40 years before. Eleanor looked at the small white place card a long while before the first guest arrived. It read, in her son's hand, simply, Nora. When Nora came in still apologizing for being 2 minutes late, still in her ordinary gray coat, Julian Calder rose from his own chair, something Margaret, watching from the doorway with the wine she'd been sent to fetch, had genuinely never once seen him do for anyone in 23 years, and pulled the new chair out for her himself. "You'll sit there from now on," he said. It was not quite a question and not quite an order, something gentler than either. "At every family dinner, from tonight forward. There is a chair for you at this table, and there will be, for as long as you want it." Nora looked at the seat, and then at him, and said nothing at all for a long moment, which Margaret, watching, understood perfectly well was its own kind of answer. Eleanor reached across and took the younger woman's hand in both of hers, the way she might once have taken her own daughter's. "Sit down, dear," she said. "You're home." Margaret Doyle rode the elevator down alone that night and found, somewhere around the 20th floor, that she had not forgotten the new intern's name even once since dinner began, a small thing, after 23 years of forgetting most of them by Christmas. She had learned to read that building the way other women read weather, who feared whom, who flattered whom, who would still be standing in 5 years and who would already be gone. She had never once, in all that time, watched the coldest room in the tower warm itself around a woman with a coffee pot and a borrowed legal pad. Riding down through the dark, quiet floors, she found she was glad to have been wrong about so much, and gladder still that she had finally been standing there to see it happen.